For 5 brutal hours inside Capitol Room 2141, Jim Jordan tried everything to break Jasmine Crockett, cut off questions, edited footage, and relentless claims that she was defending a DOJ corrupted by political bias. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she flipped the script with one leaked document and a single sentence that turned the room upside down. This wasn't just a political clash. It was a battle over justice, racial bias, and the weaponization of law. So what exactly did Jasmine reveal that silenced the attacks and exposed the game? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The summons came not with courtesy, but command. A single line, unsigned at the bottom, burned across Jasmine Crockett's inbox like a silent alarm. You are hereby required to appear before the House Judiciary Committee at 9 a.m., room 2141, Rayburn House Office Building. No explanation, no briefing, no formal courtesy extended across the aisle. Just a name at the top of the agenda, Chairman Jim Jordan, and a title that screamed vendetta cloaked in duty. Oversight hearing on the weaponization of the Department of Justice. To Jasmine, a former civil rights attorney who'd stared down racist prosecutors and walked through courtrooms thick with contempt, the signal was clear. This wasn't about oversight. This was about erasure of her party, of her president, of the very ground she stood on. By 8:15 a.m., room 2141 was already alive with murmurs. Aides shuffling papers, reporters checking battery packs, lobbyists pretending not to eavesdrop, and in the center, under the seal of the U.S. House of Representatives, sat Jim Jordan, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight, eyes cold. He wasn't just hosting a hearing, he was setting a trap. One by one, Republican members filed in behind him, like hawks perching above a battlefield. Some smirked. One even whispered, "Let's see if she folds today." Jasmine Crockett walked in without a word, blazer sharp, braids pinned. The silence that followed her was electric. She didn't need to announce her presence. She was the threat they feared. What made it worse, what boiled her blood beneath the calm surface, was that this entire circus wasn't about justice. It was about revenge. Jordan was furious that multiple Trump allies were now under investigation. Furious that facts had outpaced party loyalty. And so he twisted the gavel of his committee into a political weapon and pointed it straight at Jasmine Crockett. Why? Because she was black, because she was loud, because she knew the Constitution better than most of them combined, because she was never supposed to be in that room holding power. And then, just as the silence had settled over room 2141 like a heavy fog, Jim Jordan made his move. He gave a small, practiced nod to his aide. Instantly, the lights in the room dimmed slightly, and a large screen on the back wall came to life, glowing bright and ominous. The atmosphere shifted. What had started as a government hearing now felt more like a carefully staged television show. The screen flickered and a video began to play. But this wasn't raw, unedited evidence. This wasn't a simple presentation of facts. It was a highly edited, one-sided narrative, designed to push a single message. The video showed blurry surveillance clips of Hunter Biden, walking into office buildings, sitting at conference tables, speaking with unnamed people. It cut to DOJ officials speaking at press conferences, but their quotes were chopped mid-sentence, stripped of full meaning. Headlines splashed across the screen in big red letters. DOJ silent on Biden's dealings. Questions mount over Hunter's legal shield. The clips came fast, each one more dramatic than the last, and over it all, a deep, intense voice spoke like a movie trailer. Secret meetings, politically motivated immunity, selective justice. It sounded official, but it was clearly meant to create doubt, fear, and outrage. As the final clip disappeared, the screen went black, but one line remained glowing in white letters: DOJ shields president's son from consequences. Jordan didn't pause. He stood up like a man stepping onto a battlefield. His tone was sharp, his voice loud and cutting, meant to grab headlines as much as attention. He stared straight at Jasmine Crockett and delivered his line with practiced precision. Ms. Crockett, Can you admit to this committee that your administration is using the Department of Justice to punish political enemies and protect its own? The words hit the room like a slap. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, a carefully built trap. Across the back of the room, conservative reporters and media aides leaned forward, gripping their phones, live streaming the moment in real time. Even before Jasmine could open her mouth, social media headlines were already being drafted. Breaking: Jordan corners Crockett in DOJ corruption hearing. One journalist whispered into his mic, "She's not ready for this." A Fox News producer, watching through a live feed, smiled and told his assistant, "We've got the clip we need." And around Jasmine, the pressure rose, not because the evidence was real, but because the scene had been staged so perfectly. The video, the voiceover, the lighting, the timing of the question. It wasn't oversight. It wasn't a search for truth. It was a political performance. And she was the chosen target. She didn't move. She didn't blink. Her face remained calm, unreadable. But inside, Jasmine felt it, the ground shifting. Not from facts, not from law, but from perception, from performance, from power playing dress up as justice. She could see what they were trying to do. They weren't just putting the DOJ on trial. They were putting her on trial. Her words, her judgment, her right to be in that room, speaking truth in a system that was trying to push her out. Seated in the eye of a political storm, with every camera locked on her and every conservative waiting for her to stumble, Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't rush to defend the Biden administration. She didn't take the bait. Instead, she leaned in slightly, not with fear, but with clarity, and did something no one in that room was prepared for. She changed the direction of the conversation completely. Her voice was low but sharp, each word landing like a pin drop in a room full of lit matches. "Chairman Jordan," she began, her gaze fixed on him, calm but unshakable. "Where exactly were you when the son-in-law of a sitting Supreme Court justice accepted funding from Trump-aligned PACs?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone carried the weight of something far more powerful than volume. Truth backed by intent. The effect was immediate. The room, buzzing just seconds before with smug energy and partisan confidence, went dead silent. Not the silence of boredom, but the silence of fear. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone says the thing everyone else was too afraid to say. Jasmine had just named the unnameable. She didn't deflect. She exposed. And in that single moment, she reminded the room, and the country watching, that corruption wasn't exclusive to one party. Jordan didn't respond right away. He stared back at her, jaw clenched, caught off guard. He hadn't prepared for a counterattack, especially not one that hit at the heart of the very system he was pretending to protect. His papers lay still in front of him, but he wasn't reading anymore. He was calculating, and that, more than anything, told the truth. Jasmine's question had landed. Across the aisle, a few Democratic members shifted in their seats. One gave a knowing glance, like someone watching a chess game turn in a single move. Another offered a slow, almost imperceptible nod of respect. A quiet clap echoed from the far left corner. Not loud enough to get gavelled, but clear enough for the cameras to catch. It wasn't applause for drama. It was for precision. Jasmine hadn't just responded. She had reclaimed the hearing, moment by moment, word by word. And what made it so devastating, so honest, was that Jasmine wasn't asking a trick question. She was asking a real one, the kind that demanded real answers from people who were far too comfortable asking others to explain themselves while never doing the same. Her question pulled back the curtain. It said, "If we're going to talk about weaponized justice, then let's talk about all of it, not just the parts that make you feel powerful." She hadn't changed the subject. She had revealed the double standard buried inside the subject. And that's why the silence stayed. Because in that instant, everyone knew. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just defending herself. She was putting the system on trial. But the silence that followed Jasmine's question didn't just hang. It choked. It wrapped itself around the room like smoke, thick and undeniable. And for the first time in the hearing, Jim Jordan looked unsure. His brow furrowed, lips tightening as if fighting to keep his control from slipping further. He shifted in his chair, reached for his stack of papers, and began flipping through them. Too fast, too loud. It was the nervous shuffle of a man trying to reset a performance that had already gone off script. His eyes flicked briefly to the screen behind him, now blank, as if hoping the video would somehow reappear and reassert his dominance. But it wouldn't. The power had shifted. The illusion had cracked. And Jasmine's question, so precise, so unflinching, had done what hours of partisan speeches could not. It threw him off balance. Jordan cleared his throat and forced out a new line of questioning, this time clumsier, reaching for unrelated topics. Whistleblower credibility, old news clips, bureaucratic timelines, anything to drag attention away from the Supreme Court's ethical shadow she had just illuminated. But his words stumbled. His voice, once booming and confident, now rang a little too high, a little too rushed. And Jasmine? She didn't even interrupt. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than anything he could say. She sat poised, her hands still, her expression calm but cutting, the embodiment of composure. Because she knew what he knew and what the cameras had already caught. He had lost the room. Not because he didn't speak loudly enough, but because she had spoken with truth. But Jordan's words were already collapsing under their own weight, and Jasmine could feel it. The shift in the room, the rising discomfort behind his rehearsed tone, the restless eyes of committee members who knew when something had just gone off script. She didn't need to shout. She didn't even need to look angry. What she needed, and what she had prepared, was the truth. Not the kind you argue about on cable news. The kind you print on paper, underline, and enter into the record with your name on it. With calm, deliberate movement, Jasmine reached into the folder in front of her. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady, like someone who had waited long enough for noise to finish so facts could finally speak. Her hand emerged holding a document, a government memo, plain but official, its top edge marked with red highlights and stamped with the words confidential, DOJ internal. She didn't wave it. She didn't slam it. She simply laid it on the desk in front of her microphone and looked toward the chairman's staff. Her voice was composed, almost quiet, but its clarity carried through the marble chamber. "Mr. Chairman," she said, "I request that this document be entered into the congressional record under full committee review." There was a pause, brief but real. A few members leaned forward, already curious. She continued, her voice steady, not accusatory, just painfully direct. "This memo was provided to my office by an internal DOJ contact. It outlines a series of communications between senior Justice Department officials and several members of this very Congress. According to the memo, these communications were in reference to a specific request, that a federal investigation into a private defense contractor be delayed indefinitely." The room began to shift again, not loudly, not outwardly, but the change was there. In the tapping pens that stopped tapping, in the scrolling thumbs of reporters who suddenly froze mid-post. Jasmine looked directly at Jordan now, not with fury, with certainty. "The contractor in question," she continued, "is linked through multiple financial channels to campaign efforts supporting former President Donald Trump. The DOJ was urged to reconsider the timing of the investigation due to, quote, political sensitivities during the midterm cycle." A soft gasp could be heard from the back, but Jasmine wasn't done. She turned the page once, gently, and looked down for just a second before raising her eyes back to the committee. She delivered the final line like a surgeon making the final incision. "And within the attached list of congressional contacts tied to that delay request appears the name of Congressman Jim Jordan, listed as an unofficial legal sponsor to the case's hold." The words dropped like iron. No one spoke. No one even moved. Even the distant clack of reporters' keyboards had stopped. Jordan sat motionless, lips slightly parted, the color in his face retreating just enough to notice. He looked down, not at her, but at the memo now being passed from one staffer to the next, his own name printed in black ink on a page he had not prepared for. No lights, no video clips, no out-of-context headlines could rescue him from this. Because this wasn't an opinion, it wasn't performance, it was a receipt, a government memo, leaked or not, that tied him not to oversight, but to obstruction, And Jasmine hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't insulted anyone. All she had done was let the truth take the microphone. And now the entire room, the committee, the press, the public, was staring not at her, but at him. But truth, when it arrives without warning and without permission, doesn't land gently. It hits like an earthquake. And in room 2141, the walls were already shaking. The second Jasmine finished reading, the room burst into motion. Staffers leaned over one another, eyes scanning the pages like they couldn't believe what they were holding. Reporters rose halfway out of their chairs, whispering into phones, fingers flying across screens, sending texts that would become headlines within minutes. Even members of Congress who had spent the last hour looking bored or smug were suddenly wide-eyed, flipping through the memo, rereading the name Jim Jordan printed on government stationery, tied not to oversight, but to a request to delay justice. And then came the sound no one was expecting. Jordan's voice cracking under the weight of panic. He shot forward in his chair, face turning red, hands gripping the edges of the desk like it was the only thing holding him up. "Mr. Chairman," he snapped, voice louder than necessary, trembling just beneath the surface. This document is unverified. It's unconfirmed. You can't enter that into the record. It's hearsay. It's political slander." His words tumbled out too quickly, one over the next, like someone trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. He looked not at Jasmine, but at the chairman, at the staffers, at anyone who might give him back the power he'd just lost. But no one moved. No one reached out to save him. His hands slammed against the desk, not with strength, but frustration. The sound echoed anyway, awkward and thin, like a gavel dropped by a man who no longer had the authority to use it. "Strike it! Strike it from the record!" he demanded again. But the words didn't stick. The memo had already been entered. The cameras had already caught it. The press had already published it. And Jasmine, she still hadn't said another word. She didn't need to. Jordan stood now, shoulders tense, pacing a half step behind his chair. And then came the outburst, the moment where pressure gave way to raw emotion. "You sit there acting like some truth-teller," he shouted across the chamber, his voice pushing the edge of fury. "But you're a fraud. You're not here for justice. You're part of the machine that covers everything up. You're what's wrong with this system." He pointed a trembling finger toward Jasmine's desk, like an accusation could replace actual evidence. "You come in here waving some fake memo and think you can put my name in it and call that justice?" His voice cracked again, and this time, the whole room heard it. But Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't defend. She didn't even flinch. She just sat, hands folded, gaze steady, letting the silence do what his shouting couldn't. Command respect. Because everyone watching understood what was happening. This wasn't the sound of a man defending the truth. This was the sound of a man realizing that he no longer controlled the story. And the injustice wasn't just in how he shouted, it was in what he assumed. That she didn't belong here. That the only way she could win was by cheating. That the only version of truth that mattered was his. But Jasmine had done the one thing men like him fear most. She came prepared. She stayed calm, and she exposed the system using its own rules. And now Jordan's voice, the one that had once filled the room with confidence, was just noise. But as Jim Jordan's voice echoed off the chamber walls, louder, angrier, more desperate with every word, Jasmine Crockett did something that turned the entire dynamic upside down. She didn't rise. She didn't shout. She just looked at him. And somehow that stillness said more than any of his fury ever could. She had seen this before. Men like Jordan, puffed up by microphones and comfortable power, thought control meant volume. They thought rage was strength. But Jasmine knew better. She had lived through rooms colder than this, where no one listened until she forced them to. And this time, she didn't need to force anything. The truth was already in the room. So when she finally spoke, her voice didn't shake. It didn't waver. It didn't rush. It was the kind of voice you hear once and remember for the rest of your life. Not because it was loud, but because it was undeniably true. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't even glance at the chairman. She just looked directly at Jordan. Not with anger, but with the weight of everything he refused to see. "I didn't create this system," she said slowly, the words landing with the clarity of a hammer striking stone. "I am the result of it, the product of what happens when a system keeps betraying people like me. Not once, not twice, but over and over again." The room didn't move. For a moment, no one even breathed. There was no shouting, no gavel, no objections. Just that sentence, suspended in the air like smoke after an explosion. It was the kind of moment that didn't need commentary. It just needed silence to let it sink in. Because Jasmine wasn't just responding to Jordan, she was responding to history. To every moment someone like her had been told to wait, to sit down, to lower her voice, to not take up space. And in that one line, she shattered all of it. 20 minutes later, the moment had left the room and taken over the world. On X, the quote was already trending. Some had clipped the video and slowed it down, overlaying piano chords beneath her voice. Others posted it without sound. Just the look in her eyes, that calm, razor-sharp stare, staring into a system that had tried to swallow her whole. It wasn't just a line. It was a revelation, a reckoning, a reminder that she wasn't asking for justice. She was justice. Sitting in a chair they never built for her, speaking with a voice they never wanted to hear, and saying what needed to be said when it mattered most. And yet, even after Jasmine's quiet takedown, even after the air had changed and the momentum shifted, Jim Jordan wasn't done. He adjusted his microphone, squared his shoulders, and returned to what he thought was solid ground. Procedure, structure, authority. If he couldn't win the fight through volume or narrative, he'd do it through the very Constitution itself. He began like a professor trying to take back control of a classroom, though his voice carried more frustration than clarity. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said, holding up a printed copy of Article 1 as if it were a shield. "Congress has the oversight responsibility to investigate the executive branch. We are not observers. We are a co-equal branch of government. When the Department of Justice shows signs of partisanship, of selective prosecution, we are not just allowed, we are obligated to step in." He paused, hoping for agreement. None came. He pressed on. "This is not interference. This is not obstruction. This is our constitutional duty. That's what our founders intended, and we'd be betraying their design if we turned a blind eye." To someone unfamiliar with the law, it might have sounded convincing, strong, even righteous. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't unfamiliar. She had lived inside the law, argued it, defended it, been failed by it, and still mastered it. And when she leaned forward to respond, her tone wasn't combative. It was measured. It was exact. It was devastating. "Chairman Jordan," she began, her voice soft but sure, "you are absolutely right that Congress has oversight powers. But those powers are not limitless. They are not meant to be used as tools of pressure, especially when an active criminal investigation is underway." She lifted a legal binder from her desk and opened it slowly, carefully flipping to a tab marked in red. "The U.S. Constitution does not give Congress the authority to interfere with individual cases being handled by the Department of Justice. In fact, multiple Supreme Court decisions, McGrain v. Daugherty, Watkins v. United States, and more recently, Trump v. Mazars, all affirm that congressional oversight must serve a legitimate legislative purpose. It cannot be used as a weapon to delay, disrupt, or discredit an active prosecution." She paused just long enough to let the weight of those words settle in the air. Her voice didn't need to rise. It was the kind of voice people lean in to hear, not because it shouts, but because it speaks the truth without blinking. "Oversight," she continued, "does not mean you get to reach across the aisle and tell federal prosecutors when they can or cannot do their jobs. That's not democracy. That's interference. That's overreach." Suddenly, the room felt different. Members who had walked in expecting political theater now sat frozen, like students caught in a lecture, far beyond their notes. Staffers stopped whispering. Reporters lowered their phones. No one wanted to interrupt what had become, almost impossibly, a live constitutional seminar delivered by a woman who had been invited just to be humiliated. And here was the irony. The person they tried to frame as unqualified was now walking them through the very laws they claimed to uphold, calmly, surgically, and without missing a step. This wasn't defense. It was a reversal of power. She wasn't on trial anymore. The system was. And the quiet that followed wasn't just silence. It was respect. The kind you can't demand. The kind you only earn. And just when it seemed like the room had already reached its boiling point, when every eye was fixed on Jasmine Crockett and every breath held in anticipation of what might come next, she leaned gently toward the mic and dropped a quiet bombshell. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to call one additional witness." The sentence was so calm, so restrained, that for a moment no one reacted. Then a murmur spread across the chamber like ripples in water. A surprise witness? At this stage? Even the press, seasoned, skeptical, and half expecting a stunt, suddenly perked up. The door at the side of the hearing room opened slowly, and through it stepped a man in his late 40s, dressed plainly in a gray DOJ-issued suit, face pale, eyes focused. A former Department of Justice ethics officer, recently retired, called in just hours earlier by Jasmine's legal team under emergency rules. He took the oath with a calm hand, sat down behind the microphone, and opened a thin leather folder. What came next wasn't a speech. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was clinical, deliberate, and devastating. In clear, even tones, the man testified that during his final year at DOJ, he personally witnessed internal communications and pressure from at least 3 sitting members of Congress, all requesting that the department delay or quietly drop a federal investigation into a weapons manufacturer. The reason? The company was a major political donor to multiple Republican super PACs, with ties traced directly to the Trump campaign and members of the House Judiciary Committee itself. The language used in the communications, he said, was veiled but unmistakable, urging caution for the sake of political optics and avoiding electoral turbulence. Then came the name. He didn't pause. He didn't stutter. He just said it, clearly and without ceremony. One of the members listed in those communications, marked as having made contact through back-channel intermediaries, was Congressman Jim Jordan. The room exploded. Reporters leapt from their seats. Phones shot into the air. Staffers looked at each other, wide-eyed, mouths parted in disbelief. Some gasped. Some swore under their breath. The murmur became a roar as the words Jordan and DOJ pressure surged through social media in real time. The hearing, already high stakes, had just crossed a threshold no one could walk back from. Jordan sprang to his feet so violently that his chair nearly toppled over behind him. His voice burst out, louder than at any other point during the hearing. "This is outrageous. This witness is illegitimate. He wasn't disclosed. This is a political ambush." His face was flushed, his hands shaking slightly as he pounded the table. "I move to immediately suspend these proceedings. This entire hearing is a disgrace." But the moment was no longer his to control. He wasn't steering anything now. He was reacting. And the more he raised his voice, the more obvious it became that he was no longer in command of the narrative. He turned to the chairman, seeking intervention, authority, a lifeline. But the chairman, now pale and visibly shaken himself, simply looked at him and said, "Motion denied. The witness will continue." And with that one ruling, everything changed. This was no longer just a partisan hearing, no longer a symbolic fight, no longer a performance. This was testimony, on the record, under oath. And for the first time, it wasn't Jasmine Crockett under scrutiny. It was the very man who had tried to break her, now staring down the barrel of a sworn allegation with his own name printed in the center. Outside the chamber, the story spread like fire. News banners lit up. Breaking, witness ties Jim Jordan to DOJ interference. Live, Jasmine Crockett calls surprise whistleblower. Within minutes, the hashtag number hearing of the century began trending worldwide. Clips of the moment, the calm voice naming names, the eruption, Jordan's panicked protest, flooded every feed. Commentators whispered that this would become a landmark moment in congressional history. Late-night anchors were already rewriting their monologues. For the first time in years, a hearing had stopped being theater and started being something else. accountability. And in the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett, calm, composed, still seated, her expression unreadable, but her presence undeniable. She didn't look like someone who had won a battle. She looked like someone who had finally quietly opened a door that was never supposed to exist. But as the hearing spiraled towards something far more serious than anyone had expected, as evidence mounted and cameras rolled and reputations began to teeter, Jim Jordan reached for the one card he had left. It wasn't a document, it wasn't a ruling, it wasn't a fact. It was resentment, and it came sharpened. He leaned forward again, but this time there was no legalese, no pretense of oversight or constitutional authority. His voice, once projected with performative outrage, now turned cold, personal. "You know what this really is, Miss Crockett?" he asked, pausing just long enough for the cameras to lean in. "It's not about justice. It's about race. Every time someone challenges your position, you drag the conversation into identity, into history, into pain. You weaponize it. You turn every disagreement into discrimination." He shook his head, tone bitter now, eyes narrowed. "You always make it about race. And I'm asking you, where is the law in that? Where is the Constitution in that? Where is justice when everything becomes about skin color?" The words fell like steel in the room. And that was the point. He wasn't just challenging her. He was trying to silence her. He was betting that if he could paint her as reactionary, emotional, and racially obsessed, everything she'd said, the documents, the witness, the questions, would fade under the weight of stereotype. He wanted the room to see her not as a truth teller, but as a divider. And the worst part was, it had worked before, but not today. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean in. She simply straightened her posture and turned toward Jordan, meeting his eyes with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing the cost of telling the truth and doing it anyway. Her hands rested still. Her voice was soft, almost too soft at first. But there wasn't a soul in the room who didn't hear every single word. "Congressman Jordan," she said slowly, "when a legal system consistently punishes people who look like me, when it incarcerates us more, charges us harsher, sentences us longer, when it polices our neighborhoods but never our boardrooms, I don't have the luxury of pretending that race isn't part of the law." The room had gone silent. Even the restless shuffling of aides and the tapping of journalists' keyboards had stopped. "So no," she continued, "I don't make everything about race. But when a black man can be shot 7 times in the back for reaching into his car, and a white man can storm a Capitol building and walk out in costume, I will call that what it is." She paused just long enough to let the silence breathe. "And when justice is blind only when it's convenient, when it sees through me, but never sees for me, then I don't just have the right to speak about it, I have the duty." Every syllable was sharp, every line unshaken. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even emotional. She was undeniably clear. The clarity of someone who had learned long ago that pain is not the opposite of reason, but sometimes the fuel for it. And then she delivered the line that no one would forget. Not that day. Not for years to come. "I didn't bring race into this chamber, Congressman. It was built into the walls long before I ever walked through them." There was a sound, soft, human, from the gallery above. A woman, maybe in her mid-50s, maybe older, wiped her face and lowered her head. She wasn't the only one. A low sniffle was heard from across the press bench. Even a few lawmakers, seasoned and cynical, kept their eyes fixed forward. Lips pressed shut, hands folded. The hearing had stopped being performance. It had become something else. Something harder. Something real. Jordan, for once, didn't respond. He couldn't. Not without making it worse. Not without confirming what the entire room now understood. He had tried to accuse her of using identity as a shield, and she had turned it into a mirror, not just for him, but for the entire system. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. The audience, both in the room and across the country, wasn't listening to him anymore. They were watching her. A woman who had walked into a hearing clearly meant to discredit her, and instead put the entire institution on trial with a sentence that cut through 240 years of polite hypocrisy. Outside the chamber, the line exploded in real time. It was built into the walls before I walked through them. It was quoted, shared, stitched into reels and montages. Civil rights attorneys reposted it. Law students printed it. One reporter tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just taught a class this Congress was never prepared to take." And back inside, Jasmine didn't bask in the moment. She didn't smile. She didn't look smug or vindicated. She simply exhaled, deeply, quietly, and returned her hands to the table. Because for her, this wasn't a performance. It was her life. And every word she had just spoken was a history lesson written in blood and paperwork. This wasn't the line that ended the hearing. It was the line that ensured the hearing would never be seen the same way again. And as the echo of her final sentence still lingered in the heavy air, it was built into the walls before I walked through them. No one dared to speak. Not the chairman, not the staff, not even Jim Jordan. It was the silence that comes when everyone knows a line has been crossed that cannot be walked back. And yet the one who crossed it didn't flinch. She held the room, not by force, but by truth. And somehow, she wasn't done. Jasmine sat still for a long moment, as if deciding whether the room deserved one more truth. And then slowly she leaned forward again. Not for herself, but for everyone watching who had ever been shut out of rooms like this. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It was firm, controlled. But beneath the calm was something unshakable. Conviction forged in injustice. "Let me leave you with this," she said, her tone crystal clear. "America doesn't need more politicians. It doesn't need more podium pounders, more headline hunters, or more people chasing sound bites." She glanced once toward Jordan, who now stared blankly at the table in front of him, lips pressed tight. "What we need, what the law needs, is people who understand it. People who have lived under it, not just preached it. People who know what it's like to be punished by it unfairly and still choose to respect it." There was no pretense in her voice, no performance, just a woman telling the truth in the one place that never wanted to hear it. "We don't need more lawmakers. We need people who live the law." The sentence landed like a verdict. No one responded, not even Jordan, because in that moment, there was nothing left to say. He had come in with a strategy, a narrative, a stage, and Jasmine had torn it apart without ever raising her voice. She had outlasted him, out-argued him, out-prepared him, and most devastating of all, she had out-grounded him. For 5 hours, she never lost her thread, not once. And now she was closing like a surgeon, stitching the last wound she didn't cause. The chairman cleared his throat, quietly, almost reverently, and looked across the bench. He didn't bang the gavel. He didn't issue a summary. He simply nodded. "The committee thanks Congresswoman Crockett for her testimony." And with that, the hearing was over. But what happened next wasn't in any rule book, because as the cameras turned off and staffers rose, a sound no one expected broke the silence. A soft wave of applause coming not from the lawmakers, but from the international press seated along the back of the room. It started with one journalist, a woman from France, who stood and clapped twice, then kept going. Another followed, then another. Soon the line of foreign correspondents, there only to report the chaos, rose to their feet and applauded. Not because they agreed with Jasmine politically, but because they had just witnessed something rare: accountability in real time. Even the American press, typically stone-faced and disengaged at hearings like this, began to clap, slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether this moment was allowed. But the sound grew. And as it did, Jasmine didn't stand or wave. She simply sat still, expression calm, hands folded, her eyes drifting toward the far end of the room, where a group of young interns now looked at her not as a headline, but as a standard. And Jim Jordan? He didn't look up. For the first time in hours, the man who had set this entire hearing in motion had nothing left to throw. His stack of notes lay untouched. His closing statement, written in bold marker, was never read. He stood silently, gathered his folders, and walked out through a side door. No exit line, No dramatic spin, just silence, the same kind he had once tried to force on her. Outside the Capitol, the world was already reacting. News outlets ran banners that read, "Crockett silences judiciary with 5-hour tour de force. Jordan cornered by leaked testimony and legal precision. A hearing meant to humiliate ends in historic reckoning." Clips of her final words spread like wildfire. One video, set to piano music, showed her saying, "We don't need more lawmakers. We need people who live the law." Another had already gone viral, the one where she simply said, "I didn't bring race into this room." It was already built into the walls. But no clip could truly capture what had just happened inside room 2141. Because it wasn't just a policy debate or a partisan clash. It was a woman, a civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, who walked into a room designed to crush her and instead rewrote the story from the inside out. This wasn't just a win, it was a turning point. The kind history doesn't predict, but never forgets. And even as the echoes of applause still floated across the marbled halls of room 2141, a familiar wind began to rise. Cold, bitter, and immediate. The backlash wasn't late, it was waiting. Within hours of the hearing's close, conservative lawmakers and media operatives hit the airwaves in coordinated waves. Press releases were issued with language that felt pre-written. This was not justice, this was a show. An embarrassment to the dignity of congressional oversight. A 5-hour filibuster dressed in identity politics. They didn't argue the facts. They didn't mention the sworn testimony. They didn't dare bring up the leaked DOJ memo or the ethics witness with Jordan's name etched into it. Instead, they tried to bury the blade behind spectacle. On Fox News, the Chiron read, "Crockett pivots hearing into race rant." A popular far-right commentator sneered into camera. That wasn't a hearing, that was a TED Talk with better lighting. Others went even further, calling it choreographed grievance and radical grandstanding disguised as legal argument. But it didn't stick, because this time America saw it differently. Not in headlines, but in moments. Not through spin, but through clarity. And the moment Jasmine said, "I didn't bring race into this chamber. It was built into the walls before I walked through them," something shifted. Not just in the room, but in the culture. The clip, 5 minutes long, no edits, no music, no filters, went viral in ways no one expected. Within 24 hours, it was viewed over 62 million times across platforms. By the end of the week, it had reached every one of the lower 48 states and had even been subtitled into Spanish, French, Korean, and Swahili. In over 37 states, the moment was replayed in classrooms, barbershops, churches, college debate forums, law lectures, and town halls. Civics teachers rewrote their lesson plans to include her testimony. Law students clipped portions of her speech and analyzed it in live streams, pausing, rewinding, pointing out how she cited precedent with the same precision as a federal appellate judge. One black high school junior in Mississippi posted a clip of Jasmine's cross-examination and wrote, "They say the system is too big to fight. She sat in it and made it listen." At Columbia Law School, a constitutional law professor, not known for hyperbole, opened class with a single sentence. "Yesterday we saw something Congress forgot it could do." Harvard's Berkman Klein Center hosted an emergency roundtable called "Living the Law, the Crockett Doctrine," a full day of discussion on the boundaries of legislative oversight and prosecutorial independence, all inspired by a speech that wasn't even prepared on paper, but lived in muscle memory, pain, and discipline. And then came the unexpected. Former judges, some retired, some still sitting, began issuing their own quiet statements. One, a Reagan appointee who had once ruled harshly on sentencing guidelines, broke his post-retirement silence to pen a guest column in The Atlantic titled, "She Spoke the Law Better Than We Ever Did." In it, he wrote, "Jasmine Crockett did not manipulate the Constitution. She defended it when others only remembered it for convenience." Another judge, this time a retired military court officer, said in a podcast, "That wasn't emotion. That was jurisprudence under fire, and she didn't miss a single step." Meanwhile, Jasmine said very little. She didn't flood the talk shows. She didn't organize a press tour. She declined an invitation to appear on The Daily Show and turned down a 7-minute primetime segment on CNN. When a journalist asked why she wasn't capitalizing on the moment, she simply replied, "I didn't do this for a moment." The few times she did speak publicly in the days that followed, her tone was consistent, steady, reflective, and never triumphant. "I came into that room because I was summoned," she said during a closed-door legal symposium, "and I stayed in that chair because I knew what it meant to leave it." But while Jasmine remained quiet, the nation was anything but. In Houston, an artist painted a mural of her mid-sentence, one hand raised in precision, the quote beneath her reading, "Don't ask me to ignore the system's design. Ask why it was built that way." In Los Angeles, a spoken word poet dedicated an entire performance to that hearing, repeating the line, "We don't need more lawmakers. We need people who live the law." The crowd, mostly under 25, recited it back in unison. It didn't sound like a slogan. It sounded like a mission. And in Washington, D.C., interns who had watched the hearing from the shadows of the press benches began whispering about what they had seen. Not a moment of political defiance, but a blueprint for courage. One wrote in a private group chat later leaked to The Hill, "I saw a woman dismantle 200 years of polite power without raising her voice. I don't know what kind of politician that is, but I know it's what I want to be." And Jim Jordan? He disappeared. For the next 3 weeks, he refused all interviews. No press conferences, no commentary. When journalists approached him in Capitol hallways, he waved them off with gritted teeth and forced smiles. When Fox News requested a segment to clarify the narrative, his office sent a 2-line response. "The congressman stands by his performance. No further comment at this time." But silence for a man like Jordan was its own kind of confession. He had entered the hearing with a plan to frame, to trap, to discredit. He had stacked the deck, held the gavel, even controlled the seating arrangement. And yet somehow he left a ghost of the authority he walked in with. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just beaten his narrative, she made it irrelevant. She didn't rage. She didn't flinch. She held the law in her hands like a scalpel and carved the truth out of the noise. And what scared them most wasn't that she won. It was that she didn't even have to break a sweat to do it. She just showed up, sat down, and spoke. And the country? It listened. The echo of marble hallways faded behind her as Jasmine Crockett stepped into her office. Alone. No cameras now. No audience. Just the familiar click of the door closing behind her and the soft hum of silence pressing in from all sides. Outside, the Capitol was still buzzing. News vans lined Constitution Avenue like vultures circling headlines not yet written. On television, clips of her testimony still rolled on loop, dissected frame by panels of analysts, pundits, and scholars. People were calling it the hearing of the decade, some the century. But in here, there was no noise, only aftermath. She dropped her binder onto the desk, the weight of it thudding onto polished wood like a closing gavel. Her blazer hung heavy on her shoulders as if it had absorbed every question, every accusation, every stare from across that table. The windows were dark now, DC's skyline wrapped in dusk, its monuments glowing faint behind glass. She didn't turn on the lights. Let the quiet stay a little longer. And then she saw it, a plain white envelope. No markings, no logo, no staff initials, just resting neatly at the center of her desk, precisely aligned, like someone had placed it there with purpose. She paused, brow furrowing, picked it up. No name on the front, but the handwriting was elegant, old-school cursive, deliberate. She slid a finger beneath the seal and opened it slowly, carefully, as if the weight of the entire week might somehow sit inside. There was a single sheet of stationery, heavy, ivory, embossed with the faint gold trim of federal issue. She read it once, then again. Her eyes didn't widen. They didn't need to. "Congresswoman Crockett, I watched your testimony, not just once, twice, start to finish. In 50 years of studying and teaching law, I've never seen anyone walk into a chamber built to discredit them and dismantle its foundations using nothing but discipline, precedent, and lived truth. You didn't speak to win applause. You spoke to remind us what this country forgets too often, that justice doesn't require volume, it requires courage. I spent a long career in robes. I made decisions I believed were right. Some I still question, but yesterday I saw the law come alive again. Not in theory, in practice, through someone the system never planned for, but now can't ignore. Thank you for raising the standard, and for doing it while they underestimated you. Judge A.L. Strickland retired. Jasmine blinked. A name she hadn't heard in years, Judge Strickland, a Reagan-era appointee. She had appeared before him once, long ago, when she was a young civil rights attorney fresh out of school. It hadn't gone well. He had ruled against her motion to protect a low-income tenant group from eviction by a politically connected developer. She remembered standing in that cold courtroom thinking, they don't even see us. And now, this. She sat down slowly, folded the letter once, then again, and slid it into the side of her worn legal journal, right between a handwritten quote from Thurgood Marshall and an old Polaroid of her law school study group. She didn't need to post it. She didn't need to call a reporter. She didn't need the world to know, because she knew what this meant. Strickland wasn't offering a compliment. He was offering something rare in Washington, an admission that the system he helped uphold was shifting, and that it was Jasmine, not the men in suits, not the strategists, not the pundits, who had forced it to. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes for a moment. The echo of the chamber was still there. Jordan's voice rising, the gallery erupting, that moment of dead silence after she had said, "We don't need more lawmakers. We need people who live the law." For once, she let herself feel the exhaustion. Not defeat, not fear, just the weight that comes after carrying truth through fire without letting it burn you. Outside, traffic passed beneath the Capitol's floodlights. Inside, Jasmine Crockett sat alone, letter in hand, and realized something she'd never let herself say out loud before. This wasn't about proving she belonged. It was about showing them that she never needed their permission. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. The city was still wrapped in a pale blue hush, the kind of early silence that made even Washington, D.C. feel honest. The Capitol dome stood against the sky like a sentinel, glowing faint with dawn. And inside its winding, marble-lined corridors, Jasmine Crockett walked alone, coat draped over her arm, phone silent, and mind still writing the edges of everything that had unfolded in the last 48 hours. The hearing had ended, but the reckoning hadn't. Outside, the narrative machine kept spinning. On one end, praise, adoration, commentary calling her performance surgical, historic, constitutionally precise. On the other, dismissal, smear jobs, desperate anchors spinning 5 hours of legislative dominance into race-based grandstanding. She ignored it all, because she hadn't spoken for applause. She hadn't spoken for headlines. She had spoken to survive, and more importantly, to make space for someone who hadn't yet arrived. Her footsteps echoed softly through the empty hallway of the Rayburn building. Each step carried the weight of the chamber, the weight of that white envelope still resting in her journal, and the weight of all the women who had once stood at the edges of rooms like that and been told they were too loud, too angry, too much. She reached the long corridor outside her office. Dim overhead lights cast a soft golden sheen across the polished floor. The portraits lining the walls stared down. Faces of men who once held her seat, all carved into the history of power. Not a single one looked like her, and yet their eyes seemed to follow her steps, like ghosts of the old world watching the new one pass. Then she heard it. A voice, small, nervous, unsteady. "Congresswoman Crockett?" She stopped. A young woman stood near the far end of the hall, almost hidden in the narrow recess between two large potted plants. She looked no older than 20, brown skin, deep-set eyes full of urgency and uncertainty. Her Hill intern badge hung slightly crooked on her blazer, which looked a size too large, as if borrowed from someone else or found last minute for professional dress. A worn backpack hung off one shoulder. A notepad was clutched in both hands like a shield. Jasmine turned to her fully. "Yes? I wasn't trying to stop you. I just, I didn't think I'd get another chance. She stepped forward awkwardly, her voice shaking but her feet determined. I'm Imani. I'm interning through the CBC Fellowship Program this semester. I go to Prairie View A&M, first in my family to get this far. Honestly, I didn't even think I belonged in a place like this. Jasmine said nothing. She could feel where this was going, and she knew better than to interrupt a moment that wasn't about her, but about someone trying to name their fear in the belly of the very system that taught them to stay small. I've watched Congress for years, Imani continued, and I always thought, to make it here, you had to either sound like them, look like them, or hide what made you different. Like this place would only respect you if you played the part. She glanced at the notepad in her hands, then laughed nervously. But then I watched your hearing. All of it. 3 times, actually. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. 3? Imani blushed. You kept saying things I'd never heard in a hearing, things I've felt my whole life but didn't know how to say. Like when you said, I didn't bring race into the chamber, it was built into the walls. She flipped her notepad open. The quote was written there, underlined twice, highlighted, encircled in ink. My dad called me crying after he heard it, Imani said, her voice cracking slightly. He's a pastor back home, grew up during desegregation, said it felt like you were finally saying what he never could in public without being called ungrateful or angry. And my mom, she said she'd never seen someone sit in a room full of power like that and make it shake just by staying still. There was a pause. The air between them felt fragile, like a thread stretched tight across decades of silence. I didn't think I could do this, Imani admitted. Not politics, not law, not DC. I thought I had to shrink myself to fit through the door. But when I watched you, Congresswoman, I saw someone who didn't shrink. You expanded the room. You made space. Still, Jasmine remained silent, but her eyes were locked on the young woman now. Not judging, not comforting, just listening, fully, as if Imani's words weren't a compliment, but a report from the next generation. Imani took a deep breath. I just wanted to say thank you for showing me that surviving this place doesn't mean selling your soul to it. A long silence followed. Then Jasmine stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, until the space between them felt like nothing more than the closing of a book. What do you want to be, Imani? She asked, voice low and even. Imani blinked. I want to be a lawyer, but not the kind that gets rich and forgets where she came from. I want to help people like my grandmother, who never understood the contracts they made her sign. I want to know the law so well they can't twist it against us anymore. Jasmine nodded, not with approval, with recognition. Then you're not just here to intern, you're here to remember. Remember what? Imani asked. Jasmine leaned in just slightly. Her voice was steady. That this building wasn't built for us. But that doesn't mean we don't belong here. It means we rewrite what belonging looks like, with every word, every breath, every seat we refuse to give up. Imani didn't speak. Her lips pressed together, her eyes shimmering with something heavier than pride. She opened her mouth to say something. Maybe thank you. Maybe I needed this. But nothing came out. And she didn't need to say it, because Jasmine saw it all in her face. The fear, the fire, the future. Then as Jasmine turned to go, Imani whispered one last thing. Not loud, not performative, just soft enough that it hovered in the space like incense after prayer. You didn't just speak for yourself, you spoke for all of us still waiting to be heard. Jasmine paused at the edge of the hallway. She didn't turn around. She just let the silence wrap around those words and carry them with her. Because that was why she stayed in that chair for 5 hours. Not for applause, not to prove anything to the men in suits, but for the girl who stood shaking in a borrowed blazer, still daring to believe that law could be a language of liberation. And as Jasmine entered her office and quietly closed the door behind her, she felt it. Not relief, not exhaustion, but something older, something ancestral. She had walked into power, refused to shrink, and lit a path behind her. And as Jasmine closed her door and the hallway fell back into silence, she realized something that had been building with each step, each word, each confrontation. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a reckoning decades overdue. The lesson wasn't in the headlines. It wasn't in the viral clips or the hashtags that flooded timelines within hours. It wasn't in the praise from legal scholars or the cautious admiration from former judges, finally willing to admit that justice could come in a voice they once ignored. The real lesson, the human one, was quieter, heavier, and far more permanent. It was this: in America, truth often has to bleed before it's allowed to speak. What Jasmine faced wasn't just political pushback, it was a machine. One designed over generations to grind down dissent, especially when it wears the wrong skin, speaks in the wrong rhythm, or refuses to flatter the room. The attacks she endured, veiled and overt, weren't about the law. They were about reminding her, and everyone who looked like her, that the halls of power still belong to a tradition far older than justice, the tradition of control. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't shout. She didn't fold. She endured. And that is the lesson. Not endurance for endurance's sake, but endurance with intent. Endurance as resistance. Endurance as testimony. Because when she sat in that chair for 5 hours and refused to be baited, refused to let rage drown out reason, she redefined what strength looks like in the face of calculated erasure. The lesson is that we are still living in a country where composure in the face of cruelty is mistaken for permission, and truth is only accepted when it arrives in the language of those who built the room. Jasmine didn't change that room with volume. She changed it by turning their own tools, law, precedent, record, into weapons of precision. She wielded facts like armor and clarity like a blade. And in doing so, she reminded every student watching, every young woman unsure of her voice, every weary voter who thought no one in government could still feel real. That power doesn't always knock. Sometimes it walks in, uninvited, and plants itself at the center of the storm. But Jasmine's story isn't just about law or hearings or sound bites. It's about something deeper: the right to belong without asking, the right to speak without apology, to challenge without being punished for tone, volume, or presence. It's about what happens when a system built on exclusion is forced, finally, to listen to someone it never intended to hear. And when that moment comes, when truth refuses to shrink, it doesn't just light up the room, it rewrites the rules of who gets to sit there. So yes, there were viral quotes, there was applause, there were professors changing syllabi and young girls whispering thank you through trembling smiles. But beneath all of it, the real lesson stayed carved in the silence that followed her last line. We don't need more lawmakers. We need people who live the law. Because that's what justice is. Not performance, not noise, not theater. It's presence, it's memory, it's defiance wrapped in discipline. And it looks a lot like a black woman sitting calm and upright in a room designed to forget her, and making sure it never could again. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.